that we haven't seen since before the 1930s. We finished out the last section explaining why that may have been, what the contributing factors are: tax policy, unionization trends, changes in technology, to name just a few, after having gone through some of the measures of inequality, like the Gini coefficient, that number from 0 to 1, shares of income, and the like. The question that I left off with the last time around was the following one. Okay, so we've got this inequality. It's been increasing. We're becoming more and more unequal. We see more and more wealth and income concentrated at the very top. So what? Who cares? Okay, that's a genuine question. Is it important? Should we get upset by it? Is it making our lives worse if we're not at the very top, and so on? Okay, so is there any way of looking at the data, finding facts out about our society that might help us answer those questions? Okay, and that's what the Great Gatsby Curve is. But let me just back up one little second, talk a little bit about social mobility. Okay, so to begin with, if you recall, among the three ideal types of stratification system, the caste system, right? Really rigid, really closed. You're in a certain group because you're born into it, and you'll stay into it, and your children will be in it, and so on and so forth. Then there's more of a feudal type system, the estate system. Little bit of movement. You have people, not many and not very often, moving up the ranks or falling down the ranks. Okay, so there's movement. It's a little more open. Then you find the class system, and the ideal type of the class system you could describe as a meritocracy. The reason some people are at the top, the reason some people are at the bottom or in the middle or wherever they find themselves, is a result of individual talent and effort, right? Achievement, in other words. And one notion of fairness or rightness or justice is, if the system is meritocratic, if it allows everyone to succeed or fail, stand or fall on their own 2 feet, and there's no artificial barriers to them getting where they want to go, then the system's fair, then we're fine. And the idea there is that, look, you could have extreme inequality, okay? The have-nots are like worlds and worlds away, okay, from the haves. The very rich from the very poor, and in fact, the system's getting more and more unequal. And yet, conceivably, it could still be perfectly fair and therefore morally acceptable, for the reason that there's lots of movement. If you see lots of movement, so in other words, if that system, if it's not the case that in that system, the same people, the same families, the same neighborhoods, the same communities are staying at the top and staying at the bottom, okay? If that's not the case, and rather people are falling down or rising up from where they started in life, from where their families started, from where their parents started, that tells you that it seems the system allows everyone to compete in a kind of, fair and equal game where the rules apply to all equally, right? So think of it this way. One image that somebody's used to get across this idea is, look, so say it's a ladder that you climb, right? And what every single rung or step on that is like a level or stratum in the social class sphere. It's a different social class. You can have the rungs of the ladder moving farther and farther apart. That's what's been happening in the United States. We've had greater and greater inequality, more extreme distribution, misdistribution of wealth and income, okay? But you can have people falling down the ladder and people climbing the ladder so that they change places, and there's lots of turnover. If there's lots of turnover, then we say that the system is an open system. And we can take that movement, the fact that there's lots of social mobility, we call that social mobility, and we say that that means the system is fair, meritocratic, it's working the way it's supposed to work, and we're not going to get upset with extreme differences in wealth and income. Okay, that's one way of judging the system on a moral basis, if you want to. Moreover, you can also use other arguments. You can say, in fact, an unequal system in which you're rewarding some people handsomely, some people less handsomely, is one in which you're going to recruit the best to do the most important jobs. We've gone over this explanation in the past, and that's actually going to make people at the top much more productive, and they provide services that'll help people at the bottom, so that you actually provide a better quality of life to all people in a more unequal system than one in which everyone's equal. Okay, if you buy that argument, you can put that beside the one about meritocracy. So let's see if we can find out. Okay, so I just mentioned that idea. You can have lots of inequality, but you can also have lots of social mobility. And in fact, there's some people who said the more inequality you find in a class system, probably the more mobility you're going to find, people moving up and down. Okay? Then the question is that the case? What kind of relation do you find between growing inequality and social mobility? What do we actually find, not just in the United States, but around the world, so that we can compare the United States with other countries? And that's what the Great Gatsby Curve is going to do. Before I get to the Great Gatsby Curve, let me just show you very quickly some, just a little bit about what's been discovered and how you discover it regarding social mobility in the United States. This is getting to be a little old here. I could get more recent figures, but it gives, so this, what you're looking at here, it's called a mobility matrix. It's just this little table, and what it shows here, if you go down vertically, it shows different segments of the population according to wealth. Okay. By the way, I should mention there's a big difference between wealth and income. So wealth is stuff that you own, that's going to be worth something once you trade it in. So your house, if the value of your house in the marketplace is more than what you owe on your house, that difference between what it's worth and what you owe is a form of wealth. This house would have wealth. Stocks and bonds, okay, that's a form of wealth. Real estate, wealth is stuff that has a certain value, and for a rate you can hang on to it and then trade it in one day for cash. Income is basically cash. It's a flow. Okay, so it's what you get from month to month. A salary is okay, whether it be annual or monthly or weekly, bi-weekly, whatever the case may be. And so wealth, I'll just mention, is far more unequally distributed than income. Income is unequally distributed, but wealth is much more unequally distributed. This is a chart showing wealth, and what it shows is the following. Over here, going up and down, you give a survey to somebody and they tell you what their family was like and what their job is like right now. Okay, or how much wealth they have right now, how much wealth their family has. What this shows here is where they came from, so the poorest, and where they are right now, the poorest. So what the number 45 shows is what fraction of the poorest people in the country in terms of wealth came from families that were in the poorest. And it turns out 45%, so close to half of the people that were in the poorest came from families that were in the poorest. In other words, they didn't change. They were born poor and they stayed poor. That's what that 45% number shows you, is what fraction of the poor have basically remained within an intergenerational cycle of poverty. If you go all the way to the bottom, it shows the richest. And this is 20%. The richest 20%. Of the richest 20%, what fraction came from families that were in the richest 20%? And it turns out 55%. Okay, so richest, this bold face, the really dark number, basically gives you an indication of how much things have stayed the same. So in other words, how little movement is there, how little people are changing places, but rather staying in the class position that their families had. And what you notice is this diagonal series of numbers gives you an indication of mobility in the United States. How much are people trading places in terms of wealth? And so 45% and 55%, those are the biggest numbers. That tells you that there's the least movement among the poor and the rich. Okay? You stand the biggest chance of staying in place relative to your parents at the top and at the bottom. The smallest numbers indicate the most mobility. So here's one fact about the United States. Is it a system in which there's mobility? Yeah, there's mobility. People change places. Where is the most mobility? The most mobility is in the middle. Okay, it's not, among the poor. Okay, it's not among the wealthy. So if you want to move up in life, your best bet is to pick a family that's not at the bottom to be born into. Okay. If you want to stay at the top, your best bet is to pick a family, okay, that's already at the top. I'm not going to show you, there's other charts we could show. We could show income. We could show occupation by prestige. And what you'll see is the same picture, where there's most mobility in the middle, least at the top and the bottom. Okay, that's for the United States. What do you do now if you compare mobility to inequality? Is there any correlation? Do we find any regularities in the relationship between inequality and mobility? Does inequality have a positive or negative effect on mobility? You could argue that it has none whatsoever. It's conceivable that it has none. So this is the Great Gatsby Curve. So let me tell you what you're seeing. Okay, the vertical line is a measure of mobility. I'm not going to try to explain what the numbers mean in any detailed way, but the larger the number, 0.6, the less the mobility from father or mother to child. That is, the child becoming poorer or wealthier than the parent, moving up or moving down in class. Okay? The higher the number, the less mobility. The lower the number, the greater mobility. So what that shows you is that when you compare countries, and this was a decade ago, will the figures have changed? A little bit, but not much, from 2010 to 2020. Okay, so not much. So the picture will remain more or less the same. So what do you see? Where is the least mobility? This has come as a surprise to people. The lowest social mobility is in the United States. That's a big surprise. Why? because that's not the story that the United States is in the habit of telling itself. It tells itself just the opposite story. It says that the greatest amount of social mobility is found in the United States. That's why people come to the United States, because it's the land of opportunity, the place that a poor person can become a rich person overnight. So the figures, on the other hand, tell the opposite story. That's interesting. Okay. Yeah, and you see the countries with the greatest mobility are these guys down here. Notice that they're all from that same area of Europe. Interesting, the Scandinavian countries. Okay, now, so that's social mobility. This horizontal axis is inequality, and we already talked about the Gini coefficient. Gini coefficient gives you a number between 0 and 1. 1 would be greatest inequality, 0 would be the least inequality. Again, as you go down this line from left to right, what do you find? So the countries with the least inequality are the same countries with the most mobility. The countries with the least mobility are the countries with the greatest inequality. There we go. So there's an initial finding which seems to show that there is, in fact, a relationship, a correlation, an association between inequality on the one hand, social mobility on the other hand, and so it looks like it's predictive. It kind of looks that, like, if you have higher and higher inequality, you're going to have lower and lower mobility. Now, okay, that's just an initial finding. That's a description of what's taking place. Then from that description, you would want to jump to some kind of explanation. Why is that? How is it that inequality impedes social mobility? Or what is the relationship? What explains the relationship? Well, we won't go into that at this point. Just know that this is the result that we find. And what are the conclusions that you can sort of tentatively or provisionally draw from that result? Oh, but this is another graph that you have access to, this PowerPoint, so you can take a look at it again. These are measures of social mobility, and it shows that the United States, compared to most other wealthy nations, Denmark, Norway, Finland, Australia, Singapore, France, et cetera, the U.S. is relatively low in intergenerational mobility, parents and children changing places. It's pretty close to some other countries. Italy, okay, is pretty low. The United Kingdom, okay, that we have such close historical ties to, is pretty low as well. Okay, let me just, one last slide to summarize, I guess, the takeaway. What's the takeaway? What does the Great Gatsby Curve say? So let me just walk through this. So it shows that the U.S. is low in income mobility relative to other wealthy nations. So we saw that. Okay. It shows an association between mobility and inequality measures. The less the mobility, the greater inequality, the less mobility. Okay. So I brought up the possibility that even though the rungs of the ladder might be far apart, what many people say is it doesn't matter how much inequality it is, because it's still going to be a really fair system, because people are just jumping up and down the rungs of the ladder. Okay, and what this graph shows is not so much, or not nearly as much as other countries. So in fact, there seems to be something sticky about social class in the United States. it looks like it's a little harder to move up and down than it is in other countries. So, in short, it seems to suggest that the US class system is less meritocratic than one might suppose. Well, I mean, that's not a very happy or satisfying picture if you're concerned about meritocracy, but I'll just finish by saying it's a good thing to know. So at least we know. And if you have some kind of like, nagging feeling in the back of your mind that, yeah, it seems like things aren't as fair as they ought to be, at least you're given some corroboration there, and you can begin as a citizen to work on the basis of that knowledge. I guess that would be kind of the final, as is true of all other kinds of, a host of all of other sociological facts that may not be, that maybe more dismal than not.